Hey everybody, it's Dan. Welcome back. This is a video I've actually been thinking about for probably the past year, and certainly since this channel has taken off in the last 6 months, I've been giving it a lot of serious thought and just writing down thoughts on the topic as they've come to me, be it during the workday or what have you. But I want to talk a little bit about 3D printing, and I think that's especially relevant for this channel as I predominantly review multi-part plastic miniatures and just my thoughts on how 3D printing is going to affect that market in the near to midterm. So let me talk a little bit about who I am, because if you've been a subscriber to the channel for a while, you'll know a little bit about me. But for those who maybe are not subscribed or have not seen my prior videos, I'm a big multi-part plastics guy. I have been doing reviews of multi-part plastic miniatures for the past 6 months or so. And I got into the hobby in the late 90s, right as multi-part plastics were starting to take off. I started, like I think a lot of people, with Games Workshop products, and then I've gradually branched out since. But I am absolutely, unabashedly a plastics guy. That's my preferred method of dealing with miniatures. I do have a small collection of 3D printed miniatures. The ones that you see me painting in the background here are a unit of Highland Miniatures dwarves that I had commissioned to be printed for me, and I have a handful of other miniatures as well. So I'm not opposed to 3D printed models. I just prefer plastics. But this is the footage in the background here is just kind of as an olive branch, I guess, just to show you that I really do also enjoy 3D printed models if the sculpts are right. My background professionally, I work in accounting and finance. I got my MBA about a year ago, so I really do enjoy business, and I'm the kind of person that does legitimately read Games Workshop's financial statements in their entirety. So this is something that has fascinated me, not just from a person who enjoys miniatures standpoint, but also from a business standpoint, just kind of looking more broadly at the market of 3D printing. So I guess let me start by posing the question that I'm certain I'm going to put in the title of the video, which is, will 3D miniatures replace plastic miniatures? And my prediction is ultimately yes. There's a ton of nuance to that answer, but if I had to boil it down to a yes or no answer, I think the answer is yes. But I do want to talk about all of the nuance to that. But the truth is, if I had to just boil it down again to a one-word answer, I think 3D printing is eventually going to become so ubiquitous that it's going to replace 25% of the goods that you find at a Walmart, right? If not more. It's a question of what happens between now and that point. And there's a lot of things that can happen between now and that point. But what I predict will happen is we're going to see fewer and fewer new plastic miniature companies entering the market. And we're going to see, I think, a shift in strategies of the established players toward starting to accommodate more digital sculpts. And this is going to be a very gradual process that I'm describing here. But the best evidence that it's going to take a little bit of time is the fact that it hasn't happened yet, right? 3D printing obviously has exploded, I would say, in the last 3 to 5 years. It's really gotten to the point where you could very easily, if you don't have a printer, get 3D printed models, as I did here, for cheap, sometimes cheaper than plastic, certainly metal models. But the reason that it hasn't already completely replaced this market, the reason that companies like Victrix, Wargames Atlantic, Games Workshop, Warlord Games are all still exclusively in the metal and plastic miniature space is because there's still a market for those things. And the reason I think for that, again, I talked about nuance, this is going to be a process of, I wouldn't say replacement, but shifting, right? That we're going to be moving gradually into this kind of brave new world of 3D printing. I think I can categorize them in 3 different ways. There's 3 different reasons that this is not going to be an overnight process. This is going to be a slow and gradual process. And I would categorize them as there are barriers to entry. There are going to be 3D market fluctuations, which we'll talk about in detail here in a minute. And then nostalgia, which, again, I would like to drill down into a little bit as well. So let's talk first about barriers to entry, because they are not inconsiderable. They're I think the thing that people think about the most when it comes to whether or not to dive into 3D printing as opposed to picking up miniatures from an established manufacturer. There are upfront costs, as everybody's aware of. The most obvious is buying a printer, and they're getting cheaper and cheaper. That's going down steadily every year. I think that you can get a slightly better 3D printer for less money. However, there's all kinds of ancillary, costs to that as well. You have to have a computer. Of course, most of us have a computer, but you have to buy resin, cleaning supplies. There's software. You have to buy the files themselves. So all of that for somebody who has no experience with 3D printing is a lot to take in all at once. And I think for many of us poses the question of, because of those costs and where they currently sit here at the end of 2024, it's usually a question of like, do I buy a new army or do I buy a printer and all this ancillary supplies for a printer? And then, it will essentially pay for itself by the second army, if that makes sense. So that's usually kind of the equation people are doing when they're thinking about buying a printer. But there's not just costs involved, right? Too, there's knowledge, there's a learning curve to it. I would say, again, I think that gets easier with time as they become more and more established and more people have access to and experience with 3D printers, even if it's just like through osmosis, right? Seeing other people using 3D printers. I would liken it very much to, computer use today, how universal it is. But, in the late 80s, it wasn't something that everybody necessarily knew how to do. But as more and more people had experience with it, as more and more people ran into it, people become less fearful of the thing. But the truth is, like, even me, I grew up in the 90s. I'm pretty tech savvy. I'm very good with computers, editing software, stuff like that. But when it comes to 3D printing, I have no idea where to start. And there's lots of guides online. I'm well aware of that. I've actually read through them, but it is still a considered purchase, right? All of these things are taken into account when it comes time to put up a couple of $100 to invest in a printer. So I can certainly see how it would be an intimidating process to people who have maybe even less tech experience than I have. I mentioned 3D market fluctuations. I really didn't know what else to call this category. It's kind of a wild card, but by definition, I don't think anybody knows what this will be. But just as 3D printing kind of surprise exploded out of nowhere over the last few years, I think because this is a market that is experiencing exponential growth, what you'll find in really any market is that exponential growth is inherently an unstable thing. So whether it's going to be some kind of correction, whether or not it's going to be some kind of change to the way that this trajectory that we're on happens, I do think there's going to be some things that will slow or stagger growth of 3D printing in general over the next handful of years. And the most obvious thing that pops into my head is some kind of either increase in government oversight, regulation, legislation, something like that. We're kind of in the Wild West when it comes to files and the production of files. But just imagine, again, I'm in the United States, so obviously this is going to vary from country to country, but very simple stuff would be like taxes, right, to protect business, restrictions on file sharing. There are actually, I think, very good unanswered legal questions on ownership. This is actually just coming up in the video game world, where I saw that if you own a Steam account and you buy video games via your Steam account, you don't necessarily own them in the sense that you can't pass them on to your children, for example, as you could with a physical file. Do you own a 3D file? Could I pass, if I bought a 3D file, can I pass those down to my kids? And of course, there's all kinds of ways to work around the system, but I think as the market for 3D printing gets bigger and bigger, that's when I believe government starts to step in and start asking questions like this and start trying to regulate things. And so we're going to see more litigation, I think, is probably inevitable over things like copyright, IP disputes. We already see Games Workshop trying to kind of flex its muscles when it comes to people making knockoff Space Marine files. And as a result, even there, you're going to start seeing top 3D file companies experiencing a lot of competition where they otherwise didn't. And that's going to lead to price and quality instability, kind of uncertainty with that. Because with popularity, you're going to see an increase in prices in the file, right? So the cost of a file for a miniature, right, can vary pretty wildly right now depending on the manufacturer. So it begs the question, just like I've asked in other videos, what is the value of one multi-part plastic miniature? Well, of course, it depends on the manufacturer. But what if we get to the point where 3D printing miniatures, because of all of these things, right? If a manufacturer has to start charging more for their sculpts of 3D sculpts, what if suddenly like 3D printing is only like 25% cheaper than buying a physical product? Or what if, God forbid, we get to the point where it's actually pretty much the same cost, right? So these things can happen over time, especially once the law and government start getting more and more involved. Not to mention the attraction of scammers, copycats. Again, I kind of alluded to pirates, but fly-by-night shops and stuff like that. Any kind of bad faith actors are going to get drawn to this market as it gets bigger and bigger, and that dilutes market share for, again, these established companies that maybe have been in this space for a while, or again, manufacturers like the Victrixes of the world who might want to start making a foray into 3D printing. So all of this, again, it kind of, I'm not saying that this is going to make it to where 3D printing will not take over. Again, my thesis at the beginning is that it will. These are just issues that are, I think, inevitable in some way or another, and it's going to slow the growth and is partially why 3D printing hasn't already taken over. But in general, again, if you don't believe what I'm saying here, you just need to look for established examples like Uber, Airbnb. Those are really good case studies in what can happen with what, again, I'll refer to as exponential growth in an area that is otherwise pretty much unregulated, right? And so the other piece to this, not just in terms of like changes to the market, changes to government oversight, are questions of like, is 3D printing as it exists today going to be replaced with something even better? And I can't even speculate as to what that would be. Maybe like alternate materials. What if, for example, instead of printing with resin of varying quality, you could print with plastic, right? And other materials, right? Metal, wood, I don't know. But again, I think that anybody who said they would have predicted 3D printing would exist at the quality and level and ubiquity that it exists at today, if they tried to make that prediction 10 years ago and said that it would exist, I think they'd probably be lying. So who knows, right? That's kind of the whole point of this category, is just as we couldn't predict where we'd be at now, it's going to be very hard to predict where we're going to be at in the next 5 years. But all of this is to say, I think this is all likely to happen in some capacity. And I think the Games Workshop, for example, is banking on this category kind of gumming up the works, so to speak, to try to slow down the growth of 3D printing while they evaluate whether or not they're going to shift their strategy into 3D printing. And I mentioned too, the third category, the final category here, is nostalgia. And nostalgia is a hell of a drug. Again, like I'm painting these resin miniatures here and I'm enjoying the process, but actually what they remind me of is painting like old pewter miniatures from Games Workshop, some of the first like boxes of 10 miniatures that I would pick up that maybe had 4 or 5 poses to them. And I enjoy that a lot, but I realized part of why I enjoyed it is because it reminded me of something else. This is a really niche hobby, and I think for many of us, the reason that we still enjoy it, even into adulthood, is that it taps into, in many cases, childhood experiences for us. So even if there's something like a physical product that is objectively superior, even if resin was in every way better than plastic, better than metal miniatures, you're not going to ever see 100% adoption of the thing. Even if it's cheaper, even if it's better quality, it does not matter. Especially when you're talking about something that reminds somebody of something that they had when they were younger, you're never going to see 100% of people switch over to the thing. And again, the best examples of that are, for example, with books, right? There are plenty of people. My wife is a very avid reader, even more so than me, and she'll never touch an e-reader. She just likes physical books. Even if you get books that are cheaper, that are easier to read, easier to carry around with you, it doesn't matter. There's something about a physical book that certain people just enjoy more. And it's the same thing with video games. It's the same thing with DVDs. And again, if you want a more, I think, apt example, we don't even have to go outside of the miniature space. Look at metals. Like, there are still companies that produce metal miniatures and still people within our gaming community that prefer picking up metal miniatures, even though plastic miniatures are cheaper, even though they offer a lot better options in terms of kit bashing and variety of miniature. So you're never going to see a place where people are going to exclusively be 3D printing because they prefer that. The better question, and this goes to the first two categories that we talked about, is whether or not plastic and metal companies can survive the market disruption that is coming and is happening right now with 3D printing becoming more and more prevalent. So in summary, again, if I had to boil it down to one word, the answer is yes. I think 3D printing is going to replace plastic. I don't think this is going to happen even within the next 10 years. I think it's going to get more and more predominant. I think more and more people are going to be switching to it. And as a result, I think two things are going to happen. You're going to see, again, fewer and fewer companies, new miniature companies producing miniatures the traditional way. You're going to see fewer of them entering the market. And then you're also going to see the established companies like Victrix, like Warlord Games, like even Games Workshop. I think it's semi-inevitable that they're going to at least start making some kind of foray into the digital space, just so that they're not kind of left out, right? As this gets bigger and bigger, they don't want to be the only companies not producing digital sculpts. It's just the question in the meantime, going back to my second category of kind of these wild card questions of kind of finding some of the answers to those problems. I know Games Workshop probably wants to wait until they have some better answers there before they kind of jump into this space. But yeah, again, look at War Games Atlantic. I think is probably the best example of a company that is starting to do exactly that, which is have traditionally produced miniatures, but also have a digital arm. And I think there's actually added value in that too for companies that can or are in a position to provide both. Not only that you're not losing out on potential customers who maybe exclusively want to 3D print or exclusively want to purchase multi-part plastic miniatures, but I actually think there's a lot of value in providing both, because as a multi-part plastic miniature guy, I also see value in being able to print bits, to have specific bits for my established multi-part plastic kits. So all of that is to say, again, I kind of apologize if this ended up more rambly than I intended, but I think we're kind of entering a brave new world here. It's very difficult to predict what's going to happen in the next 5, 10, certainly 20 years. But for now, I'll continue to enjoy my multi-part plastic sets, and if you do, I hope you do too. But the truth is, if you enjoy 3D printing, I hope that you enjoy those miniatures too, in whatever format you prefer, even if it's metals, etc. That's the beauty of this, is that currently we have tons and tons of options to choose from, and I think we should try to be as present as we possibly can and enjoy whatever we have while we have it. So anyway, appreciate you sticking through to the end of this one. I think I'm going to have a separate video up with the finished unit of dwarves here. Maybe do some details on the painting. But until then, as ever, appreciate you dropping by. And until next time, happy gaming, everybody.